Picture this. You're lying in bed, lights off, maybe a little too tired to watch anything but not quite tired enough to actually fall asleep. Your brain is still buzzing. You need something interesting. Something that pulls you in without demanding too much from you. Something that rewards you for just listening. Well, tonight you are in exactly the right place. Because we are diving deep into one of the most brilliantly written, shockingly creative, and genuinely underrated seasons of television ever made. Season 2 of The Boys. And whether you watched it when it first dropped or you've seen it a dozen times, I promise you there are things about this season that will genuinely surprise you. Details you probably missed. Behind-the-scenes stories that make the whole thing even more impressive. And facts that reveal just how much thought went into every single frame. So get comfortable. Settle in. And let's talk about The Boys Season 2 in a way you've never heard before. Let's start with the thing that makes Season 2 so remarkable compared to its predecessor. When Season 1 dropped, nobody really knew what to expect. The Boys arrived as this loud, irreverent, politically charged antidote to superhero fatigue, and audiences were genuinely shocked by how far it was willing to go. But here's the thing about shock value. It only works once. The second time around, you can't just do the same tricks. You have to evolve. And the creative team behind The Boys understood that completely. Season 2 wasn't just more of the same. It was a deliberate deepening of everything the show was trying to say. The satire got sharper. The characters got more complex. And the storytelling became genuinely layered in ways that rewarded close attention. One of the most fascinating aspects of Season 2 is how it handled the introduction of Stormfront. And let me tell you, the casting of Aya Cash in that role was one of the most inspired decisions the show ever made. Before The Boys, Aya Cash was perhaps best known for her comedic work, and that background turned out to be absolutely crucial to how the character worked. Stormfront is terrifying precisely because she's charming. She's funny. She's relatable. She speaks in this casual, internet-savvy language that makes her feel like someone you might actually follow on social media. And that is the point. The show was using her character to make a very specific and very pointed argument about how modern extremism operates. It doesn't announce itself with a red flag and a manifesto. It comes wrapped in humor and charisma and relatability. The fact that Aya Cash could deliver that performance with such precision while also making it feel completely natural is genuinely extraordinary. Now here's something that might genuinely surprise you. The character of Stormfront in the original comic books is actually a male character. A fairly straightforward neo-Nazi villain without the kind of complexity or social commentary layered into the television version. The decision to reimagine that character as a woman, and specifically to frame her as this social media savvy, image-conscious, deeply manipulative figure, was a creative choice made specifically for the show. And it transformed what could have been a one-note antagonist into something that actually says something real about the world we live in. The showrunners were looking at the rise of online radicalization and the way that certain ideological movements had learned to rebrand themselves using the aesthetics of progressivism and internet culture. Stormfront is the fictional embodiment of that very real phenomenon. Let's talk about Karl Urban for a moment, because Billy Butcher is one of the great performances currently on television, and Season 2 really pushed that character into new territory. What a lot of people don't know is that Karl Urban brings a lot of himself to that role. The physicality, the accent, the sheer intensity of how he inhabits Butcher. There's a rawness to it that doesn't feel entirely performed. Urban has talked about finding the character's anger very accessible because the things Butcher is angry about, the abuse of power, the corruption of institutions, the way ordinary people get ground up by systems designed to protect the powerful, those are things that genuinely resonate with him. Season 2 in particular gave Urban some of the most emotionally demanding material of his entire career, particularly in the scenes involving Butcher's wife Becca and his complicated relationship with her son Ryan. Watching Butcher navigate that relationship is watching a man who has built his entire identity around hatred suddenly confronted with the possibility that love might require something more from him. The character of Ryan, who is Homelander's biological son, is another element that Season 2 uses with remarkable intelligence. Because Ryan is not a villain. He is a child. A deeply confused, genuinely frightened child who has been raised in complete isolation by a mother who is trying to protect him from both Vought and from his own father. The show never lets you forget that. Even as Homelander becomes increasingly unhinged and the threat he represents becomes more acute, Ryan remains this figure of pure innocence caught in the middle. And the way Season 2 explores the idea that children can be either the best or worst thing that happens to someone like Homelander, that his son could either redeem him or destroy whatever was left of his humanity, is genuinely sophisticated storytelling. Speaking of Homelander, Anthony Starr's performance in Season 2 is something that genuinely deserves to be studied. There is a scene in the season where Homelander is alone, standing on a rooftop, and he begins laughing and crying simultaneously in this way that is profoundly disturbing. It communicates everything you need to know about where this character is psychologically without a single word of dialogue. Anthony Starr has spoken about the research he did for the role, looking at how narcissistic personality disorder manifests, how people who have never developed a secure sense of identity behave when that identity is threatened. Season 2 is really where that research pays off most visibly, because the threat to Homelander's identity in this season isn't external. It's internal. He is forced to confront the fact that he might not actually be the good guy he has always needed to believe he was. Now let's talk about something that comes up a lot when people discuss The Boys, and that is the show's relationship to real superhero franchises. The satire is obviously pointed at the MCU and DCU in general terms, but Season 2 gets quite specific. The idea of superheroes being used to justify military intervention, the manipulation of public perception around supers being deployed overseas, the congressional hearings about superhero accountability, all of this is clearly in conversation with real debates that were happening in American political culture at the time. And the show doesn't pretend to be neutral about any of it. The Boys has a point of view, and Season 2 sharpens that point of view considerably. The superheroes in this show are not metaphors for something vague. They are very specific metaphors for corporate power, for the military-industrial complex, for media manipulation, and for the way celebrity culture insulates the powerful from accountability. Here's a fascinating production detail that most viewers have no idea about. The show films primarily in Toronto, Canada, not in the United States. And yet it needs to convincingly depict New York City, various American small towns, government buildings, and corporate headquarters. The production design team on The Boys is working at an extraordinarily high level to make Toronto stand in for all of these locations, and Season 2 in particular required some incredibly creative problem-solving to pull off certain key sequences. The city of Toronto and its surrounding areas have a remarkable flexibility as a filming location, but matching the specific visual language of New York requires a level of attention to detail that the show's crew has become almost legendary for delivering. Let's shift to talking about Deep, because the arc that Chase Crawford is given in Season 2 is one of the most underrated storytelling choices the entire show has made. Deep was introduced in Season 1 as a fairly simple villain, a harasser who uses his position of power to exploit women and faces no consequences. Season 2 recontextualizes that character in a genuinely unexpected way. It doesn't excuse what he did, not even slightly, but it does explore the psychology of how someone ends up becoming that kind of person. The Church of the Collective subplot, which is clearly modeled on Scientology, is used to examine how predatory organizations exploit people who are already damaged, who are already desperate for belonging and validation. Deep is pathetic in Season 2, and that is precisely the point. The show is asking you to understand him without asking you to forgive him. The Gills scene. If you know, you know. And if you don't know, you're in for quite a surprise. There is a scene in Season 2 involving Deep's Gills that is among the most audacious, genuinely strange pieces of television I've ever encountered. It manages to be simultaneously absurd and emotionally sincere, which is a combination almost no other show has ever successfully achieved. What's remarkable about that scene is that it actually advances the character. It's not shock for shock's sake. The scene is about Deep confronting his own body, his own identity, his own sense of self-worth, through this deeply weird lens. The fact that the writers found a way to use something so bizarre to say something genuine about body image and self-acceptance is a testament to how carefully the show is actually constructed. Now let me tell you something about the writing process for Season 2 that really illuminates why the season feels so cohesive. The writer's room for The Boys operates somewhat differently from many other prestige television shows. Showrunner Eric Kripke, who also created Supernatural, has talked about the importance of having writers in the room who come from very different political and cultural backgrounds. The show doesn't want an echo chamber. It wants genuine debate about what the satire should be targeting, how far to push things, what actually constitutes meaningful commentary versus mere provocation. Season 2 in particular benefited from this approach because it was dealing with subject matter, the rise of white nationalist movements, online radicalization, media complicity and extremism, that required a nuanced and thoughtful approach to avoid either trivializing the issue or becoming preachy about it. Eric Kripke has been remarkably candid in interviews about the fact that the show often writes itself into positions that make him personally uncomfortable. Not because the content is gratuitous, but because the satire forces him to examine things he would rather not examine. The character of Homelander, for example, has become in some corners of the internet a figure of admiration rather than horror. Fans who identify with his worldview, who see his contempt for ordinary people and his rage at those who would constrain him as something aspirational. Kripke has said that this is simultaneously the most disturbing and the most validating response to the show, because it confirms that what they're depicting is real and present in the culture, not something they've invented. Let's talk about the finale of Season 2, because it contains one of the most memorable moments in the show's entire run. The scene where a character's head explodes. I'll try to keep this relatively spoiler-light for anyone who might somehow be hearing this before watching. But that moment is not just a shock gag. It is the culmination of an entire season's worth of thematic work about the limits of corruption, about what happens when systems designed to manage dangerous people fail, and about the way violence has a way of turning back on those who use it as a tool. The visual effects team on that sequence spent an enormous amount of time getting the practicalities right, but more importantly, the writers spent enormous care setting up the emotional and narrative logic that makes the moment land as more than just gross spectacle. Here is something that I find genuinely fascinating about Season 2 from a structural perspective. It is a season about exposure. Almost every major character arc in the season involves some version of a secret being threatened. Vaught's secrets about Compound v Homelander's secret about Becca and Ryan. Stormfront's secret history. The boys own secrets from each other. Even secondary characters like A-Train and Maeve are navigating questions about what happens when the lies they've been living start to unravel. The entire season operates around this central anxiety about revelation, about what it costs to keep things hidden and what it costs when they come to light. And this is not an accident. The theme is consistent from the first episode to the last, woven into every storyline simultaneously. Now here's a behind-the-scenes detail that really changed how I thought about the show. The costume design on The Boys is doing things that are easy to miss on a first watch. The soup costumes are designed to look like what a corporate marketing team would create if they were trying to sell heroism as a brand, not to evoke actual functionality or power. The textures, the colors, the little branding details. All of it is designed to read as product first and as superhero costume second. But in Season 2, there's a subtle evolution in some of the costumes that tracks character development. Starlight's costume in particular goes through changes that mirror her psychological journey through the season, her increasing resistance to Vaught's control, her reclamation of her own identity. These changes were entirely intentional. Elizabeth Shue joins the cast in Season 2 as Madeline Stillwell's replacement, and the character of Ashley brings something that the show really needed at that point in its run. A corporate villain who is just trying to survive, who isn't ideologically committed to anything beyond her own advancement, and who therefore represents the most common and perhaps most dangerous kind of complicity. Ashley isn't a true believer. She's just someone who has decided that the cost of resistance is too high. And watching her navigate the impossible demands of managing superheroes who could vaporize her with a look is both terrifying and darkly funny in exactly the right measure. Let me tell you about the music in Season 2, because this is another element that doesn't get nearly enough credit. The show's music supervisor has an almost supernatural ability to find needle-drop moments that recontextualize both the songs and the scenes they're placed in. There is a particular sequence in Season 2 set to a classic piece of music where the juxtaposition between the wholesome familiarity of the song and the absolute carnage unfolding on screen creates this vertiginous feeling that is entirely unique to the boys. The show understands that music is not just mood enhancement. It's commentary. The song choices in The Boys are always saying something about the scene they're soundtracking. Something that I want to highlight specifically for anyone who appreciates craft in storytelling is the way Season 2 handles the character of Mother's Milk. Laz Alonso gets some of the best material of his career in this season, and what makes it work is the tension between MM's desperate need for order and control, his meticulous, careful, methodical approach to everything, and the absolute chaos that defines his life as part of The Boys. Season 2 gives him a family subplot that grounds all of his psychological quirks in something emotionally real. His obsessive tendencies aren't played for comedy. They're shown as survival mechanisms developed by someone who has been unable to prevent terrible things from happening to people he loves. That's rich, careful character work. Now I want to spend some time on a detail that really reflects the show's commitment to internal consistency. The world of The Boys has its own internal logic around how powers work, how Compound V functions, and how the Vought Corporation has structured its entire operation around managing and monetizing these abilities. Season 2 expands this worldview significantly. The congressional hearings about soups, the revelation about Compound V being given to people in other countries, the corporate and political machinery around all of this. It's extraordinarily detailed world building that rewards attention. The show clearly has documents, timelines, and histories for this world that never make it onto screen but that inform every decision the writers make. Here's something that might make you appreciate the show on a different level. The Boys films its more extreme violence and its more provocative content with a deliberate aesthetic that is meant to be uncomfortable rather than exciting. This is an intentional choice. In most action movies and superhero films, violence is choreographed to be cool. The camera angles, the editing rhythms, the sound design all work together to make it feel thrilling. The Boys deliberately subverts this. When violence happens in The Boys, it usually looks wrong. The camera doesn't glorify it. The editing makes it feel sudden and unglamorous. The sound design emphasizes the wet, physical reality of what's happening. This is the show making an argument with its filmmaking language about how we've been trained to consume violence as entertainment. Let's talk about the ending of Season 2 and what it sets up. Without going into too much detail, the season ends with Homelander in a genuinely interesting place. He has not been defeated. In fact, in some ways he has consolidated power. But his psychology has shifted. He has been forced to confront his own vulnerabilities in ways that he has not fully processed. And the dynamic with Ryan represents both his greatest potential weakness and his most dangerous new motivation. Season 3 of The Boys picks up threads from everything Season 2 planted, but the seeds are all right there in the final episodes of the second season if you know what to look for. One thing that often gets overlooked in discussions of The Boys is the performance of Jack Quaid as Huey Campbell. Huey is the audience surrogate character, the everyman who serves as our entry point into this world of superpowered horror. But Jack Quaid finds unexpected depths in what could have been a purely functional role. In Season 2 particularly, Huey goes through a crisis of his own effectiveness. He starts to question whether he is actually useful to the boys or whether he's just tagging along. And the choices he makes as a result of that crisis, some of them very wrong choices, feel earned because of the groundwork Quaid has been laying since episode 1. There's a really interesting piece of trivia about the casting process for The Boys that relates to Season 2 specifically. When they were searching for the right person to play Stormfront, the casting team reportedly went through an extensive search looking for someone who could thread a very specific needle. The character needed to be immediately likable. She needed to have the kind of warmth and charisma that makes you want to trust her. But there also needed to be something just slightly off, just barely perceptible, that a careful viewer might catch on a rewatch. Aya Cash nailed this so completely that several people involved in production have said they occasionally had to remind themselves during filming that the character was the villain. Now here is a piece of context that I think is genuinely important for understanding Season 2 and why it landed the way it did. The season was released in 2020, during an extraordinarily turbulent period in American and global history. The conversations the show was having about extremism, about institutional corruption, about the relationship between media and truth, these were not abstract conversations. They were conversations that were happening in real time, right alongside the show. And the creative team has talked about the strange and sometimes uncomfortable experience of watching their satire feel less like exaggeration and more like documentary as the year unfolded. That context of release doesn't just make the show feel prescient. It helps explain why it resonated so deeply with so many viewers. Let me tell you about the practical effects work in Season 2, because this show uses more practical effects than most people realize. The production takes a hybrid approach, combining CGI with practical elements in ways that keep things grounded. The gore, for instance, is frequently practical. The decision to use real practical effects for many of the show's more extreme physical moments is part of what gives the violence its particular quality of wrongness, that feeling that what you're seeing couldn't quite have been manufactured. There's a texture to practical effects that CGI still struggles to replicate perfectly, and the production designer and special effects coordinator on The Boys have been quite deliberate about preserving that texture. Something worth discussing is how Season 2 handles the representation of trauma, particularly among its female characters. Season 1 was criticized in some quarters for how it depicted sexual violence, with some arguing that it was too explicit, that it was using assault as a plot device rather than engaging meaningfully with its consequences. Season 2 responds to that criticism in interesting ways. The show is more thoughtful about giving its female characters agency in how they process and respond to what has been done to them. Maeve's arc in particular, her refusal to be used as a tool anymore regardless of the personal cost, feels like the show working through and deepening its approach to these themes. The show also does something really interesting with A-Train in Season 2. A-Train is not a sympathetic character. He made a terrible choice in Season 1 and then made it worse with his subsequent choices. But Season 2 gives him a storyline that forces you to hold two things at once simultaneously: his villainy and his victimhood. Because A-Train is also someone who has been exploited, who has been built up and then discarded by Vought, who has had his identity and his community weaponized against him. The show doesn't use this to forgive him, but it does use it to make the world feel more textured and real, because in the real world, people are frequently both. Here's a final behind-the-scenes detail that I love. The script for the season finale was rewritten multiple times right up until filming began, and even after filming began, certain elements were adjusted based on what the cast was bringing to the material. The performers on this show, particularly Anthony Starr and Carl Urban, are doing things with their characters that consistently surprise the writers and push them to find new angles. Television at its best is a collaborative art form, and The Boys Season 2 is a really beautiful example of what happens when you put genuinely talented people in a room together and give them the freedom and the trust to follow the work wherever it leads. What makes The Boys Season 2 ultimately so enduring as a piece of television is that it takes its audience seriously. It doesn't talk down to you. It doesn't pretend the world is simpler than it is. It looks directly at some of the most complicated and uncomfortable aspects of contemporary culture: the way we manufacture heroes, the way we consume outrage, the way power insulates itself from consequence, and it finds a way to make all of that viscerally entertaining without blunting the critique. That combination is extraordinarily rare. Shows that are genuinely funny, genuinely scary, genuinely provocative, and genuinely thoughtful at the same time don't come along very often. And the fact that Season 2 managed to raise the bar set by an already excellent first season is the thing that really cements its legacy. It would have been so easy to simply do more of the same. More blood, more shock, more outrage. But instead, the show chose to do something harder and more interesting. It chose to grow, to complicate, to ask harder questions and resist easier answers. Season 2 is where The Boys became not just a great genre show, but an actually important piece of popular culture. Something that was genuinely in conversation with its moment in a way that very few things achieve. So the next time you're drifting off and you want something interesting to think about, something that rewards the way your brain works when it's just slightly untethered from the demands of full consciousness. Think about Stormfront and what she says about how modern extremism sells itself. Think about Homelander crying and laughing on that rooftop and what that tells you about the psychology of people who never learn to be accountable. Think about Butcher standing in the ruins of everything he thought he knew, looking at a little boy he didn't ask for, and choosing to be better than he has any natural inclination to be. The Boys Season 2 is not just great television. It's a mirror. And the thing about mirrors is they show you things you can't see any other way. Sleep well. And maybe when you wake up, watch it again. Picture this. You're lying in bed, the room is dark, and your mind just won't stop racing. You need something to pull your focus away from the noise of the day, but you don't want anything too intense, nothing that's going to spike your adrenaline or keep you wide awake. What you need is a calm, steady voice walking you through fascinating little details about a world you love. And if that world happens to be The Boys, one of the most creative, wildly imaginative television universes ever built, then you are in exactly the right place tonight. So go ahead and get comfortable. Pull that blanket up. Close your eyes if you want. We're just going to talk about this incredible show, the hidden layers underneath it, the fascinating connections, the little facts that make the whole thing feel even richer. There's no pressure here. Just settle in and let the words wash over you. The Boys as a television series didn't start from nowhere. It came from a comic book written by Garth Ennis, which was itself a pretty wild and darkly satirical take on what the world might look like if superheroes actually existed and were managed by a massive corporation. But when Eric Kripke adapted it for television, he brought something completely unique to it. Now here's what makes that interesting in a sleepy sort of way. Eric Kripke isn't just the showrunner of The Boys. He's also the creator of another enormously beloved television series called Supernatural, which ran for 15 full seasons and developed one of the most devoted fan followings in television history. So when you watch The Boys, you are watching something created by the same mind that built that entire other universe. Two very different worlds, same creative fingerprint running through both of them. And because of that connection, The Boys has quietly become something of a reunion place for actors who spent years working on Supernatural. Jensen Ackles, who plays the character Soldier Boy on The Boys, is probably the most famous example of this. He played one of the two lead characters on Supernatural for the entire run of the show. But he's not alone. Many of the actors and people involved in The Boys passed through Supernatural at some point along the way. This creates a kind of invisible thread that runs beneath the surface of The Boys, connecting it to all those years of supernatural storytelling. For fans who know both shows, watching The Boys sometimes feels like a homecoming in the most unexpected and wonderful way. Let's drift a little deeper into the world of Soldier Boy specifically, because his character is one of the most layered and quietly tragic figures in the entire show. On the surface, he comes across as a brutish relic from another era, a man out of time in the worst possible way, someone who holds on to outdated ideas and throws his weight around with zero self-awareness. But underneath that, there are these small, almost tender moments that keep slipping through. His relationship with Homelander, for instance, slowly develops into something that feels genuinely paternal, which is deeply ironic given how monstrous both of them can be. Watching two people who are essentially walking disasters find some kind of father and son connection is one of those things that only The Boys could pull off without it feeling absurd. Homelander himself is one of the most psychologically complex antagonists in recent television history, and there's something almost meditative about thinking through who he actually is when you strip away all the laser eyes and the cape. At his core, he is a deeply abandoned person. He grew up in a laboratory. He had no parents, no family, no genuine human connection. Everything he knows about love and belonging came from the outside world watching him from behind glass, or from a public that worships him without actually knowing him. And that worship became the thing he built his entire identity around. So when that worship feels threatened, or when someone gets close enough to make him feel something real, he can't handle it. The vulnerability terrifies him. And so he destroys it. There's something almost unbearably human about that, even though he is clearly portrayed as a villain. The show never lets you forget that monsters are made, not born. Now let's think about the corporation at the center of everything, Vought International. The writers built Vought as a satire of corporate America in the most elaborate and detailed way. They have their own media empire, their own film studio, their own product lines, their own political connections. They've essentially made superheroes into a brand, and that brand is worth more to them than anything else, including the actual human beings involved. The dark satirical twist is that this doesn't feel that far from reality. The way celebrity is managed, the way public image is constructed and protected, the way corporations will sacrifice individuals to preserve their reputation. The Boys takes all of that and just turns the volume up to an almost unbearable degree. And yet somehow, the closer you look at it, the more familiar it starts to feel. One of the quieter and more interesting creative choices the show makes is how it handles its in-universe media. There are advertisements, movies, news broadcasts, social media posts, merchandise, all existing within the world of the show as if this is just the normal backdrop of life. The in-universe film called Dawn of the Seven, for example, is treated within the show as a massive blockbuster production, with all the behind-the-scenes drama and ego conflicts you would expect from a real Hollywood production. This layering of fictional media within the show's already fictional world creates a strange depth to everything. You start to understand how these characters are perceived by the ordinary public who can't see what we see as the audience. The gap between public image and private reality is one of the central tensions the show keeps returning to again and again. Let's talk about the character of Sage for a moment, because she is one of the most quietly unsettling people in the entire series. She is presented as the smartest person alive, someone whose intelligence is so vast that it becomes its own kind of curse. Her backstory involves a grandmother who loved her, a medical establishment that dismissed her, and a grief that eventually curdled into something deeply cold. She doesn't want power for the reasons most people want power. She doesn't want fame or control or adoration. What she actually wants is to be left alone. And she has come to believe that the only way the world will ever leave her alone is if it essentially tears itself apart. That is a specific kind of nihilism that the show presents not as cartoonish villainy but as something that grew organically from real pain. It's disturbing precisely because you can trace the emotional logic of it even if the conclusion is monstrous. The reference the show makes to a famous episode of The Twilight Zone is particularly rich for those who catch it. In that old black and white episode, a bookworm who just wants peace and quiet to read survives a nuclear apocalypse and finally has all the time in the world to read every book he's ever wanted. And then his glasses break. It's one of the most heartbreaking ironic endings in all of classic television. The connection to Sage's plan in The Boys is genuinely clever, because it raises the same question. Even if she gets what she wants, even if the world burns and she's left in silence, will it actually give her what she's looking for? Or will there be some equally devastating irony waiting for her at the end? Now let's drift towards something a little lighter. The comedy in The Boys is something that deserves its own moment of appreciation. The show is technically a dark superhero satire, but it operates with a very specific comedic sensibility that goes far beyond simple parody. There are jokes layered inside jokes, cultural references folded into absurdist situations, and a willingness to go to places that most television writers would never dare approach. What keeps it from feeling gratuitous is that the comedy usually serves a purpose. The most outrageous moments are often also the most pointed criticisms of something real. The grossness is frequently the point. When something makes you recoil and laugh at the same time, you're being forced to confront your own reaction, which is exactly what good satire should do. Terra, Butcher's dog, is one of those details that the show uses with surprising emotional depth. On the surface, a dog who behaves exactly the way Terra behaves is just pure comedy. But within the context of the show, the dog represents something about Butcher himself. Butcher is a man who has burned almost every meaningful human connection in his life. He is abrasive and ruthless and self-destructive in ways that push people away. But the dog stays. The dog doesn't care about any of that. And the scenes between Butcher and Terra carry this quiet emotional weight that sneaks up on you if you let it. The show uses that animal connection to remind you that even the most damaged people have some corner of themselves where something soft still lives. The relationship between Kimiko and Frenchie is another one of those emotional cores that the show returns to throughout its run. Kimiko doesn't speak in the traditional sense for much of the series, and yet her relationship with Frenchie is one of the most communicative and emotionally alive connections in the whole show. They understand each other without words in ways that the more verbally expressive characters never quite manage. There's a tenderness between them that exists in contrast to all the violence surrounding them. And the show is smart enough to complicate that tenderness too, to let it feel fragile and uncertain in the way real relationships do, rather than just presenting it as a safe harbor in a storm. Here's an interesting little detail about the world building that doesn't always get talked about. The show takes great care to establish its own internal history, its own mythology about how superheroes came to exist and how Vought built its empire around them. References to past decades, to earlier generations of heroes, to experiments and cover-ups and historical events that Vought quietly influenced. This isn't just window dressing. It creates a sense that the world of the boys has been going on long before we arrive to watch it, and will continue in some form after the story ends. That historical depth is part of what makes the fictional corporation feel so believably menacing. They didn't build this overnight. This is the result of decades of careful, deliberate manipulation. The character of Starlight, Annie January, sits at a very specific intersection that the show finds particularly interesting. She came into the Seven as someone who genuinely believed in the possibility of being a hero, of using extraordinary abilities to do actual good. She wasn't naive exactly, but she was idealistic in a way that the world of the show immediately began attacking from every direction. Watching her hold onto pieces of that idealism while also becoming something harder and more practical is one of the ongoing emotional journeys of the series. She represents the question of whether it's possible to maintain your values inside a corrupt system, or whether the system always wins eventually. Mother's Milk is one of those characters where the show does something genuinely thoughtful with motivation. His reasons for being in the fight against Vought are deeply personal, connected to family history and loss in ways that make his commitment feel grounded in something real rather than abstract heroism. And the show pays attention to how that personal history shapes the way he sees the larger mission. He's not fighting for some general idea of justice. He's fighting for something specific and human, which is ultimately what makes him one of the most relatable people in a cast of characters who are frequently operating at the extreme edges of human behavior. Think for a moment about how the show handles power specifically, physical superhuman power, and what it does to people psychologically. Almost every superhero in The Boys who has significant power has been damaged by it in some way. Either they were given it too young, or under circumstances that were traumatic, or in a context where the power was immediately used to corrupt rather than protect. The show seems to argue pretty consistently that power in the hands of people who haven't developed the emotional and moral framework to use it responsibly is one of the most dangerous things imaginable, which maps directly onto critiques of real-world power structures, even without the supernatural element. There's something deeply satisfying about how the show builds and releases tension across episodes. It doesn't follow a predictable rhythm. You can be deep in a comedic sequence and then suddenly something genuinely affecting happens. Or you can be braced for something terrible and the show pivots into absurdist humor instead. This unpredictability is part of what keeps people watching, but it also creates a specific emotional experience where you're never quite settled, never quite sure what register the show is operating in at any given moment. Which, when you think about it, is also what living inside a world with unchecked powerful people might actually feel like. The satirical targets of The Boys are broad in scope but consistent in their angle of attack. Corporate greed, celebrity worship, religious manipulation, political opportunism, media complicity. These aren't separate themes that the show visits occasionally. They're woven together into a single interconnected critique of how power operates in modern society. And the show does this without ever becoming preachy, which is genuinely difficult. The secret is that the satire is always expressed through character and situation rather than through direct statement. Nobody steps up to deliver a lecture. The critique lives in what happens, in the consequences characters face, in the gaps between what characters say and what they actually do. Let's close out this evening with the idea that makes the boys perhaps most interesting as a thought experiment. The superheroes in this show are not heroes in any meaningful sense. They are celebrities who happen to have extraordinary abilities. The corporation treats them as products. The public treats them as gods. And many of them have come to believe the mythology built around them. The question the show quietly asks underneath all the chaos and violence and dark comedy is a simple one. What would it actually take to hold power accountable? And the answer the show keeps returning to is that it takes ordinary people refusing to stop, even when the cost is enormous, even when the odds are completely ridiculous, even when it seems like the forces aligned against them are simply too vast and too entrenched to ever be moved. That's not a comfortable answer. But it's an honest one. And on that note, you can let all of that settle gently into the back of your mind, into that place where the thoughts get quieter and the body gets heavier and the night wraps around you like something familiar and warm. There's nothing more to figure out tonight. The world of the boys will still be there tomorrow, full of its wild characters and impossible situations and hidden layers waiting to be noticed. But right now, this moment is just for resting. So breathe slowly, let the thoughts drift off one by one, and drift gently into sleep knowing you've spent these quiet minutes well. The most unsettling superhero ever put on screen wasn't created by Marvel or DC. He was raised in a laboratory, never told he was loved, and given the power to destroy everything he touched. The Boys is a show that exists in this fascinating space between satire and genuine emotional storytelling. It takes everything you thought you knew about superheroes and flips it completely upside down. The premise sounds simple on the surface. What if the people with extraordinary powers were not the noble protectors we always imagined them to be? What if instead, they were deeply flawed, psychologically damaged, and in some cases genuinely monstrous? What comes out of that question is one of the richest, most layered television universes ever constructed. Let's start with something that gets overlooked surprisingly often. The show draws heavily from a comic book series that came out in 2006. The original comics were written by Garth Ennis, who is known for being absolutely relentless when it comes to pushing boundaries. The television adaptation keeps the core spirit of that material alive, while also expanding and deepening certain storylines in ways that even fans of the comics found genuinely surprising. The showrunners made a deliberate choice early on to honor what made the source material so powerful, while also making it feel like something fresh and specifically designed for the world we live in right now. One of the most interesting things about the show's main villain, Homelander, is that his psychology is meticulously constructed. Every single thing about him, from his obsessive need for approval to his terrifying outbursts of violence, traces back to a very specific childhood that the show reveals gradually over multiple seasons. He was raised in a laboratory. He never had a parent in any meaningful sense. The people around him during his most formative years treated him as an asset rather than a child. That kind of deprivation creates something almost impossible to repair. The show takes that damage seriously, and what emerges is a character who simultaneously wants to be loved by absolutely everyone and also holds everyone in contempt. That contradiction is what makes him so fascinating to watch. The actor who plays Homelander has spoken in various interviews about how he approaches the role, and one thing that consistently comes up is the idea of playing someone who has no genuine emotional anchoring. Everything Homelander feels is exaggerated, performative, or completely disconnected from reality. When he smiles, it never quite reaches his eyes. When he laughs, there is something hollow underneath it. These are all deliberate choices, and they come through in a way that makes your skin crawl even during moments that should feel lighter. Now here is something truly interesting about the way the show handles its generational trauma theme, because this is one of the most carefully crafted threads running through the entire series. The show essentially argues that trauma does not just affect the person who experienced it. It gets passed down. It mutates. It becomes the lens through which damaged people see the world and eventually the template they use when interacting with others, especially the people closest to them. You see this most clearly in the relationships between fathers and sons. Each generation inherits something broken from the one before, and the tragedy is that even when characters are aware of this cycle, breaking it turns out to be extraordinarily difficult. Soldier Boy is a character who embodies this idea perfectly. He is presented as a kind of Golden Age hero, the original American superhero, a product of the post-World War II era when America was deeply anxious about its standing in the world and desperately wanted its own myths and legends. The show is very specific about how this character came to exist. After the war, there was this enormous appetite for symbols of American strength and superiority, and a character like Soldier Boy fit perfectly into that cultural moment. He was strong, conventionally handsome in that mid-century movie star way, and he projected an image of uncomplicated patriotic power. But behind that image was someone who carried their own wounds. The show makes clear that Soldier Boy himself had a brutal upbringing, complete with a father who was abusive and cruel. He learned what relationships looked like from someone who treated love as a weapon. And so when he eventually had a son of his own, which he did not even know about for most of his existence, he had no template for anything other than what he had been taught. The cycle continued. Homelander grew up without Soldier Boy, yes, but he still inherited that damage through other means, through the clinical coldness of the laboratory, through the manipulative warmth of people who only cared about controlling him. And then there is Ryan, Homelander's actual biological son, a young boy navigating an almost unimaginably complicated situation. He loves his father. Children often love their parents regardless of what those parents have done, because love and safety feel like the same thing when you are young. But Ryan is also perceptive enough to sense that something is deeply wrong. The show handles this character with real tenderness. He is not simply a prop in the larger story. He is a person trying to figure out who he is while surrounded by adults who all have their own agendas and their own damage. One of the most poignant things about Ryan's storyline in the later seasons is the moment when he discovers that things he believed to be true about his family were not true at all. When a child discovers that the story they were told about their own origins was a lie, something fundamental shifts inside them. The ground under their feet is no longer solid. This is something that real survivors of family dysfunction talk about all the time. The rewriting of your own history is sometimes more traumatic than the original wound, because it means you have to question not just what happened, but what you understood about your own life. Now let's talk about the broader world of the show, because one of its most brilliant achievements is the way it constructs the infrastructure of this universe. Vought International is not just a company. It is a stand-in for every massive corporation that has ever wrapped itself in idealistic language while pursuing fundamentally self-interested goals. The show understands that the most dangerous villains are not the ones who openly announce their cruelty. The most dangerous villains are the ones who have convinced themselves and everyone around them that they are actually the good guys. The character of Stan Edgar is one of the show's most sophisticated creations for exactly this reason. He is not loud. He is not theatrical. He does not give monologues about domination or victory. He is simply a man who understands how power works at a structural level, and he uses that understanding with cold precision. When he says that corporations are the true villains, more dangerous than any individual with superpowers, he is not being ironic. He genuinely believes this because he has spent decades operating within that system and watching it produce results that individual violence never could. There is a speech in the later season that captures something genuinely important about how systems of power perpetuate themselves. The argument goes something like this. You can remove a person from power. You can expose them. You can even destroy them. But the structure that made them powerful, the institutions, the money, the cultural mythology built around their image, that structure persists. It finds a new vessel. It adapts. This is not a cynical or hopeless observation. It is actually a call to think about change at a deeper level, to address the roots rather than just the visible branches. The science fiction elements of the show, particularly the substance called Compound V, are used to explore questions about pharmaceutical power, about what happens when profit and human experimentation intersect without sufficient oversight. The show draws explicit parallels to real historical atrocities, moments when human beings were treated as experimental subjects by institutions that had convinced themselves the ends justified the means. These are not comfortable parallels, and they are not meant to be. Friedrich Vought, the fictional scientist whose legacy haunts the entire show, is clearly modeled on the very real phenomenon of Nazi scientists who were recruited by the United States government after World War II through a program historically known as Operation Paperclip. The show does not shy away from what this means. If the foundation of your entire superhero industry was built on atrocity, if the very substance that creates these powerful beings was developed through the torture and murder of innocent people, then everything built on top of that foundation carries that weight. Every superhero in the show, whether they know it or not, is connected to that original violence. One of the recurring visual and thematic motifs of the show is the contrast between what things look like on the surface and what they actually are underneath. The Seven, the show's central superhero team, exists primarily as a marketing product. Their public appearances are managed by publicists. Their relationships are manufactured for media consumption. Their personalities are packaged and sold. The show draws this out in a way that feels uncomfortably familiar given how celebrity culture actually functions in the real world. Starlight is interesting precisely because she starts out genuinely believing in the mission. She grew up with authentic faith in superheroes as symbols of hope and protection. When she discovers what the reality of being a corporate superhero actually looks like, the disillusionment she experiences is written all over her face in every scene. She does not immediately become cynical. She does not flip into pure pragmatism. She struggles. She tries to reconcile what she believed with what she is learning. That struggle is one of the most human things in the show. Huey, her partner, has his own version of this journey. He enters the story as someone who has experienced the direct violence of superhero recklessness, someone who lost someone he loved to a casual accident that a superhero did not even bother to pause for. His anger is righteous. His desire for accountability is completely understandable. But the show is also honest about how anger, even righteous anger, can become its own kind of trap if you are not careful with it. Huey spends much of the series learning to be dangerous without becoming what he hates. Butcher is probably the most complicated character in the show's ensemble. He has all the qualities that genre fiction likes to give its anti-heroes. He is ruthless and intelligent. He is capable of extraordinary violence when the situation demands it. He is also genuinely committed to a cause he believes in deeply. But the show refuses to let him be simply cool or simply tragic. It insists on showing you the actual cost of the choices he makes. When Butcher hurts someone, when he lies or manipulates or destroys something in the service of his mission, there are consequences that ripple outward. People suffer. Trust is broken. The people who believed in him have to decide what to do with that information. His relationship with Ryan is one of the most emotionally loaded in the entire series. On one level, Butcher sees Ryan as a threat, as a potential Homelander in the making, a child with devastating power and uncertain moral development. On another level, Ryan represents something Butcher has lost and can never recover. There is a complicated protective instinct that lives inside his hostility, and the show gives you enough glimpses of it to understand that even this most guarded and destructive character carries something tender underneath all the damage. The world building in the show extends into some genuinely fascinating territory when it explores the religious dimension of superhero worship. There is something the show keeps circling back to, which is the idea that in a world where people with godlike power actually exist and are publicly visible, the human impulse toward religious devotion does not disappear. It just finds a new object. Homelander understands this on some instinctive level, and in the later seasons he begins actively cultivating it. He does not just want to be admired. He wants to be worshipped. He wants the kind of unconditional devotion that does not ask questions, that does not require accountability, that simply surrenders. The show makes this critique of authoritarian movements very carefully and very specifically. The rallies, the iconography, the way dissent is treated as betrayal, the way followers are encouraged to define themselves entirely in opposition to imagined enemies. These are not abstract warnings. They are drawn from very specific historical and contemporary sources. The writers have been thoughtful about not making this a partisan thing in the simplest sense. The critique is broader than that. It is about how charismatic authority figures exploit the genuine human need for belonging and meaning. The Deep is one of the show's most unexpected emotional landscapes. He starts out as a figure of somewhat grotesque satire, a powerful figure who abuses his position and then faces consequences he considers unfair. But somewhere along the way, the show found something genuinely pathetic and almost sympathetic in him. He is someone who has never developed any meaningful inner life. He defines himself entirely through status and through what others think of him. When that external validation is taken away, there is nothing underneath. No actual self to fall back on. His relationship with aquatic life becomes the one place where he experiences something close to genuine feeling, and the show plays this for dark comedy while also letting it be genuinely sad. Mother's Milk is the character who perhaps best represents the show's argument about how ordinary people find the courage to resist systems that feel too large and too powerful to challenge. He is not someone who wants to be a hero. He has a family he loves. He has a normal life that he wants to return to. But he also has a history with Vought that made turning away impossible. His commitment is not abstract. It is not ideological in the airy sense. It is personal and specific and rooted in actual loss. That is what makes him believable as someone who keeps going even when the situation seems completely hopeless. Frenchie and Kimiko as a pair explore something the show does surprisingly tenderly, which is the question of what a meaningful life looks like for people who have been shaped by violence. Kimiko was turned into a weapon. She did not choose her power. She did not choose the world she was pulled into. What she wants, with a clarity that cuts right through all the chaos around her, is something quiet. She wants connection. She wants a future that belongs to her rather than to the emergency she was drafted into. Whether or not she gets that future is something the show holds in careful suspension. The spin-off elements that the show has begun to develop point toward an even more elaborate universe, one that stretches back through decades of American history. The idea of exploring the origins of Vought in the post-war period, of seeing how the superhero mythology was constructed from the ground up during the Cold War era of anxiety and ambition, is genuinely exciting from a storytelling perspective. The show has always been interested in history, in how the present is shaped by things that happened before any of the current characters were born. Expanding backward into that territory gives the mythology more texture and more weight. One of the most technically impressive things about the show is how it manages tonal shifts. In a single episode, you can move from something absolutely grotesque and shocking to something quietly heartbreaking to something genuinely funny and then back again. This should not work. Shows that try to cover that much tonal ground usually end up feeling incoherent or manipulative. But the writing and direction maintain such clear control of the emotional logic that each shift feels earned rather than jarring. You understand why this moment follows that moment even when the surface texture feels completely different. The music choices throughout the series deserve their own mention. There is a particular joy in how the show places classic rock and pop songs in completely unexpected contexts, letting the familiar sounds of beloved music become strange and sometimes sinister when attached to images that recontextualize them entirely. This is a technique with a long history in film and television, but the show uses it with particular wit and precision. As you drift towards sleep, carry with you the idea at the heart of all of this storytelling. Power does not corrupt in a simple mechanical way. What power does is reveal. It takes what is already inside a person and removes the normal social pressures that keep it hidden. The kindness that a genuinely kind person carries comes out more freely when they have power. The cruelty that a cruel person has been managing comes out too. The world the show builds is not a world where extraordinary people are simply bad. It is a world where extraordinary power applied to ordinary human damage produces consequences that ordinary human communities struggle to contain. The most hopeful thing about it is that even in that world, people keep trying. They keep reaching toward each other. They keep believing that something better is possible. And that, in the end, is worth dreaming about. The show that made superheroes terrifying is ending, and the secrets buried inside Season 5 are almost too wild to say out loud. The Boys has been building toward this moment for years. Season 5 was announced as the final season of the show, meaning everything the writers, producers, cast, and crew have been constructing since the very beginning was always pointing toward this conclusion. That weight is hard to overstate. When a show knows it is ending, the energy around it changes entirely. The desperation to tie things together properly, to honor what came before, to go out on a high note rather than fizzle away like so many shows before it. That pressure shapes every single decision made in the writing room, on set, and in the editing bay. And from everything that has come out about Season 5, that pressure was very much felt by everyone involved. Let us start with something that might surprise you if you have been following the show casually. The Boys is based on a comic book series written by Garth Ennis and illustrated by Derek Robertson. The comic ran from 2006 to 2012, and it was genuinely one of the most provocative, boundary-pushing pieces of comic book storytelling ever published. But here is the thing that makes the show fascinating from a creative standpoint. The television adaptation does not follow the comic closely. It uses the comic as a launching pad, a source of tone and certain characters and some plot threads, but the show has branched off dramatically in its own direction. This means that even readers of the original comics were watching Season 5 without knowing exactly how things would end. The show carved out its own mythology, its own version of these characters, and its own conclusion that does not simply mirror what the comics did. That creative independence is genuinely rare, and it is one of the reasons the show has felt so alive and unpredictable. Now, as you settle in a little deeper, let me tell you something about the production scale of Season 5 that is worth appreciating. The Boys is one of the most expensive television productions in Amazon Prime Video's history. The visual effects work alone is staggering. Every season has pushed the boundaries of what streaming television can accomplish visually, and Season 5 was described by those involved as the most ambitious in terms of scope and scale. The final season needed to deliver on years of storytelling, which meant the action sequences, the world-building moments, and the character payoffs all had to feel larger than anything that came before. That is a significant undertaking. The crew behind the scenes, the visual effects artists, the stunt coordinators, the costume designers, all of them were working toward creating something that would feel like a proper cinematic finale rather than just another television episode. One of the most interesting things about The Boys as a show is what it actually represents beneath all the violence and the satire. At its core, the show has always been a story about power. Specifically, about what happens when power goes completely unchecked. Homelander, the show's central villain played with absolutely terrifying commitment by Anthony Starr, is not just a bad superhero. He is a portrait of narcissism, trauma, and the catastrophic consequences of giving someone with unresolved psychological damage complete and unlimited power. Season 5 had to reckon with what that character arc ultimately meant. Where does someone like Homelander end up? What does the world look like if he wins? What does it look like if he loses? These are not simple questions, and the show has never offered simple answers. Anthony Starr's performance across the entire run of The Boys has been one of television's great acting achievements. The way he plays Homelander, with this terrifying combination of desperate neediness and volcanic rage, is genuinely unsettling. In interviews leading up to Season 5, Starr spoke about the emotional toll of inhabiting this character, about the difficulty of finding the final note for someone this complex. He wanted to make sure the ending felt honest to who Homelander had always been rather than convenient or tidy. That kind of investment from a lead actor in the final stretch of a show makes a real difference to the quality of the finished product. Let your mind wander a little here. Think about the world of The Boys for a moment. It is a world where superheroes are not government operated. They are corporate products, managed, marketed, and monetized by a massive conglomerate called Vought International. The genius of this concept is how it mirrors real-world conversations about celebrity, corporate power, and the commodification of heroism. The show is not subtle about its satirical targets. It has taken aim at media companies, political movements, celebrity culture, and the ways in which the public can be manipulated through carefully crafted narratives. Season 5 pushed these themes further than any previous season, with the political landscape of the show's world mirroring real-world tensions in ways that made some viewers genuinely uncomfortable in the best possible way. Here is a fact that might keep your curiosity ticking just long enough before sleep takes over. The character of Starlight, played by Erin Moriarty, underwent one of the most significant character evolutions in the show's history. When we first met Annie January in Season 1, she was an idealistic young woman genuinely excited about becoming a superhero. By Season 5, she had been through experiences that would have broken most people. What the writers did with her journey was track how someone maintains their fundamental goodness under impossible pressure. Moriarty has spoken about how physically and emotionally demanding the later seasons were, and how the final season required her to dig into emotional territory she had never accessed in previous years. The relationship between Starlight and Butcher, these two people from completely different worlds who end up needing each other in unexpected ways, became one of the emotional cores of the finale. Speaking of Billy Butcher, Carl Urban's portrayal of this character has been another one of the show's great accomplishments. Butcher begins the show as something close to a straightforward anti-hero. A man with a mission, brutal methods, and a reason that feels somewhat sympathetic. But as the show progressed, the cracks in his character deepened, and the show began asking harder questions about whether Butcher was actually the good guy he believed himself to be. Season 5 had to answer those questions definitively. Urban has talked in interviews about how he wanted the final season to honor all the complexity that had been built into this character without giving him an easy redemption or an unearned fall. The nuance required for that kind of performance is considerable. Now let us drift into some behind-the-scenes territory that is genuinely fascinating. Eric Kripke, the showrunner of The Boys, is the creative force at the center of everything. He spent years working on the adaptation, developing it from a relatively straightforward pitch into something much more politically charged and thematically ambitious. Kripke has been very vocal about wanting the show to feel genuinely dangerous, to push into territory that makes audiences question their own assumptions. In the lead-up to Season 5, he described the writer's room process as the most intense of the entire series, with debates about where characters needed to end up that sometimes got genuinely heated. That collaborative tension is often what produces the most interesting creative outcomes. One of the things that makes The Boys unique in the television landscape is its willingness to destroy characters that audiences have invested in. The show has never been precious about its cast. Major characters have been killed off in shocking ways throughout the run, and Season 5 was not going to break that tradition. The unpredictability of the show is one of its greatest assets because it means viewers can never fully relax. Even in your most comfortable sleep-adjacent state, your brain is probably somewhere in the back registering the fact that nobody on this show is truly safe. That tension is deliberately maintained by the writers as a tool to keep audiences engaged and to give the story genuine stakes. Let me tell you something about the music of The Boys that does not get discussed enough. The show has always used music in a deeply intentional way. The soundtrack choices, often popular songs deployed in moments of extreme violence or emotional irony, are a signature element of the show's aesthetic language. The music department for Season 5 had a significant task in front of them. How do you choose songs for the final chapter that feel like a culmination of the show's musical identity while also serving the specific emotional needs of each scene? The team behind the music, working alongside the directors, spent considerable time making those decisions. The result is a final season where the music feels both familiar in its approach and fresh in its specific selections. There is something worth knowing about the physical production of The Boys that is easy to overlook when you are watching it from your couch or your bed. The show films primarily in Toronto, Canada, though it regularly creates the impression of being set across the United States and beyond. The production design team builds environments of extraordinary detail. The Vought Tower interiors, the suburban neighborhoods, the underground spaces where the boys operate, all of these are constructed with a level of care that makes them feel lived in rather than like television sets. That groundedness is part of what makes the fantastical elements of the show land so effectively. When something impossible happens in a space that feels completely real, the impact is significantly greater. As you let yourself sink a little deeper into that comfortable state between awake and asleep, here is something to turn over in your mind. The Boys, particularly in its final season, was dealing with questions about legacy. What does it mean to fight against something enormous and corrupt? Does it matter if you win or lose? Can one person or one small group actually change the systems that seem too large to touch? These are not questions unique to a fictional world. They resonate because they are questions people genuinely grapple with when they look at institutions and power structures that feel immovable. The show never pretends to have easy answers, and that intellectual honesty is part of what has made it matter to so many people. The relationship between the boys and its audience is genuinely interesting from a sociological standpoint. The show has attracted a fan base that is extraordinarily passionate, but it has also attracted attention from people who perhaps missed some of the satire and interpreted certain characters as aspirational rather than cautionary. This is something Kripke and the cast have addressed publicly on multiple occasions, particularly around the character of Homelander. The writers had to be mindful in Season 5 of how they were closing out this character's story in a way that was unambiguous about the show's moral position without becoming preachy or simplistic. That is a genuinely difficult creative challenge, and how they navigated it is one of the more discussed aspects of the final season. Let your breathing slow down a little. Let the details of the day drift back. We are going to keep moving through these fascinating layers of a show that has meant a lot to a lot of people. The ensemble cast of The Boys is one of the best assembled groups in streaming television history. Beyond the leads, the supporting players have been essential to the show's texture. Characters like Frenchie, played by Toma Capone, and Kamiko, played by Karen Fukuhara, provided the show with emotional counterweights to some of its heavier material. Their relationship across the entire run became one of the most genuinely touching elements of a show that is not exactly known for being gentle. Season 5 had to find the right conclusion for them as well, and the care taken with their arc in the final season reflects how seriously the writers took every thread in this story. There is something worth mentioning about the guest cast and special appearances that Season 5 featured. One of the joys of a show like The Boys is the way it occasionally pulls in surprising names for limited appearances, often deploying them in ways that are simultaneously unexpected and completely logical given the show's satire-driven world. The final season used this approach strategically, bringing in faces that felt significant in the context of what the show was saying about celebrity and power rather than just as stunt casting for its own sake. Here is something genuinely fascinating about the writing process for Season 5. The writers' room for the final season reportedly knew from very early in the process which character deaths were coming, which relationships would resolve, and what the final image of the show would be. Working backward from a known ending is a different creative experience than building a season with the destination still uncertain. It allowed the writers to plant seeds and establish patterns that would pay off in specific ways, creating a season that felt architecturally coherent from beginning to end rather than making things up as they went. That structural intentionality is evident in retrospect when you look at how storylines that seemed disconnected early in the season ultimately converged. The visual language of Season 5 represented an evolution of the show's aesthetic approach. The directors brought in for the final season worked closely with cinematographer to develop a look that felt slightly different from previous years, signaling that this chapter was something distinct. There is a quality to the lighting choices and camera movement in the final season that feels heavier, more deliberate, as if the world itself knows that something conclusive is coming. These are the kinds of craft decisions that audiences often feel without being able to articulate why a scene hits differently than expected. Let us talk about something that has been a consistent strength of the show from the very beginning. The Boys has always done exceptional work with its female characters. In a genre that has historically not prioritized the depth and complexity of its women, The Boys gave its female characters genuine agency, genuine flaws, genuine contradictions. Queen Maeve, played by Dominique McElligott, had one of the show's most interesting arcs in earlier seasons. The show has not been content to let female characters exist primarily in relation to male ones. They have their own drives, their own histories, their own failures and triumphs. Season 5 continued this commitment to complexity, giving its women material that was as rich and challenging as anything given to the male leads. There is a fascinating parallel that runs through the final season between individual psychology and institutional corruption. The show has always understood that systems do not become corrupt on their own. They are corrupted by people, by specific choices made by specific individuals who have the power to do differently. Season 5 traced this connection with particular precision, showing how the personal wounds and unresolved traumas of specific characters rippled outward into consequences affecting millions of people in this fictional world. That psychological framework for understanding systemic problems is actually quite sophisticated and represents some of the show's best thematic work. As you let yourself get even more comfortable, think about this. The boys managed something that very few shows in the superhero genre have achieved. It made you feel the weight of superpowers as something terrifying rather than aspirational. In most superhero stories, powers are gifts, things to be celebrated and deployed heroically. The boys reframe them as something closer to a curse, or more accurately, as an amplification of whatever the person already was. Give someone with empathy and good judgment enormous power, and they might do genuinely good things. Give someone with unresolved trauma and narcissistic tendencies that same power, and you get Homelander. Season 5 pushed this idea to its logical conclusion, examining what it finally takes to address something that powerful and that dangerous when the normal mechanisms of accountability have completely broken down. The production crew behind the scenes in Season 5 reached numbers that rivaled major feature film productions. The coordination required to bring a season of this complexity to life involves hundreds of people across departments that audiences rarely think about. The props department alone had to manage an enormous inventory of items specific to this world. The art department had to maintain consistency across a fictional universe that has developed significant internal detail over 5 seasons. The wardrobe team had to manage character looks that had evolved across years while also introducing new visual elements appropriate for the final chapter. All of this invisible work accumulates into the experience of watching an episode and simply believing the world on screen. Here is something that sits at the interesting intersection of fiction and reality that The Boys has always played with. The show frequently references and parodies real-world media culture, political rhetoric, and corporate behavior in ways that are deliberately close to actual events. The writer's room reportedly has a practice of constantly monitoring real-world developments and asking how they can be incorporated or reflected in the story they are telling. This gives the show a quality of immediacy and relevance that many genre shows lack. By Season 5, the political landscape of both the show's world and the real world had become so intertwined that watching certain scenes felt startlingly pointed. Let your mind drift with this next one. There is a character in The Boys named Black Noir who has gone through one of the stranger and more interesting journeys in the show's history. The character's arc across the seasons, including revelations about their nature and identity, reflects the show's willingness to completely subvert audience expectations and then do something genuinely unexpected with the material that emerges from that subversion. Season 5 had to find a meaningful place for the legacy of this character within the larger resolution of the story. The Boys has been consistently praised by critics not just for its entertainment value but for what it represents as a piece of cultural commentary. Television critics who might otherwise be dismissive of superhero content have written seriously about what the show is doing and why it matters. This critical respect has shaped the show's production in interesting ways. When a creative team knows that thoughtful people are paying close attention to what they are saying and how they are saying it, there is an additional layer of accountability that influences decisions. The writers of Season 5 were very much aware that the ending of this show would be analyzed and discussed in depth, and that awareness shaped the ambition of what they attempted. Something worth knowing about the actors as a group is how much they genuinely seem to enjoy each other's company and how that chemistry translates to the screen. The ensemble energy of The Boys is not manufactured. The cast has spoken across many interviews about the friendships they have developed over the course of the show and about how working together on the final season carried a genuine emotional weight because they all knew it was coming to an end. That bittersweet awareness of finishing something meaningful permeates the performances in Season 5 in ways that are difficult to quantify but absolutely present. The humor of The Boys is one of its most discussed and most divisive elements. The show is genuinely funny, often in ways that are deeply uncomfortable. It uses comedy as a pressure release valve, deploying absurdist or darkly comic moments within sequences of extreme tension in order to manage audience experience in a specific way. Season 5 maintained this balancing act even as the stakes reached their highest point. The ability to be genuinely funny within a story that is also asking serious questions is one of the rarer creative skills, and the writers of The Boys have demonstrated it consistently. There is a quieter element of the show that sometimes gets overshadowed by the more explosive content. The Boys has always found time for small, intimate character moments that exist outside the main plot machinery. Conversations between characters about their fears, their regrets, their hopes for things they believe they do not deserve. These moments, often just two people talking in an unglamorous setting, are where the show does some of its most affecting work. Season 5 included a number of these quieter scenes that longtime fans have pointed to as among the most emotionally resonant in the entire series. Your breathing is probably slower now. Good. Keep going with me just a little longer because there is more worth knowing. The relationship between the boys and the superhero genre more broadly is worth reflecting on. The show arrived at a moment when superhero content was reaching a kind of saturation point in popular culture. Rather than adding to that saturation, it offered a fundamentally different perspective on the genre's assumptions and conventions. It asked what superheroes would actually look like if the world they operated in was recognizably like our own, with the same power dynamics, the same corruption, the same gap between stated values and actual behavior. Season 5 brought this interrogation of the genre to its most pointed and definitive expression. Garth Ennis, the creator of the original comic, has been publicly appreciative of what the television adaptation has done with his source material, even where it diverged significantly. This relationship between original creator and adaptation team is not always harmonious, and the fact that Ennis has expressed genuine enthusiasm for the show speaks to the respect with which the television creators approached the spirit of what he originally created even when they departed from a letter of it. Something to sleep on. The legacy of The Boys as a show will likely be discussed for many years. It arrived at a specific cultural moment and responded to it with genuine creative ambition and moral seriousness. The final season was the opportunity to cement that legacy or undermine it, and by most accounts from both critics and fans, what was delivered in Season 5 was worthy of everything that came before it. Whether you agree with its conclusions, whether you found its resolution satisfying or challenging, the show earned the conversation it prompted. The technical achievement of the visual effects in Season 5 deserves a final mention. The artists and technical teams who created the visual language of this world worked across the entire production timeline, from pre-production design through principal photography and into the long post-production period. Some of the more elaborate sequences in the final season involved effects work that was in development for over a year before the episodes aired. The invisible craft required to make the impossible look ordinary is something that audiences experience as effortless when it works properly, which means the people responsible for it only get noticed when something goes wrong. In Season 5, very little went wrong. The Boys gave us something rare in popular entertainment. A story with genuine moral stakes, characters who were allowed to be genuinely complicated, and a willingness to follow its own logic even when that meant going to uncomfortable places. Season 5 was the conclusion of that promise, the delivery of everything the show had been building toward across years and hundreds of thousands of words of storytelling. And that is a good thought to carry you gently toward sleep tonight. All those years of work, all those people, all those decisions made in rooms you will never see, by people whose names scroll past in credits that go by too fast to read. All of it adding up to something that you watched in the dark, that made you feel things, that gave you something to think about. The world of The Boys is a dark one. But the fact that stories like this get made and watched and talked about says something quietly hopeful about the people who make them and the people who love them. There is something human in wanting to look at power clearly, to refuse to dress it up in a cape and call it good, to insist on asking harder questions even when easier answers are available. So as your thoughts slow down and the details of this fictional world begin to blur at the edges and blend with whatever images your sleeping mind is starting to assemble, just know that you spent this time in good company. With a story that tried to be honest about difficult things. With characters who were messy and human even when they could fly or punch through walls. With a show that knew it was ending and tried to end with integrity. Let the sounds around you fade. Let the weight of everything you carry today get a little lighter. The Boys Season 5 has come and gone, and it left a mark. And now, it is time to rest. Sleep well. The most chaotic, violent show on television was specifically designed to put you to sleep. And somehow, that's exactly what's going to happen tonight. The Boys is one of those rare shows that operates on multiple levels simultaneously. On the surface, it looks like a superhero story, but underneath it's a sharp, biting piece of social commentary wrapped in some of the most outrageous television ever produced. And the more you dig into the details, the more fascinating it becomes. So let's start at the very beginning, with the origins of the whole thing. The show is based on a comic book series written by Garth Ennis and illustrated by Derek Robertson. The comics were actually so controversial and so dark that DC Comics originally dropped the series before it even really got going. They decided the content was just too extreme for their imprint. The series eventually found a home with Dynamite Entertainment and ran for 72 issues. Now here's what's interesting about that. When the show was eventually developed for Amazon Prime Video, the showrunner Eric Kripke, who you might know from creating Supernatural, made it very clear early on that the show would not be a direct copy of the comics. They would take the spirit, the themes, the characters, and the general shape of the story, but they would tell it in their own way. And that approach turned out to be one of the smartest decisions anyone made in the entire production. Now as you're lying there starting to relax, let's talk about the names in this show, because the naming conventions are actually really clever and worth thinking about as you drift. Vought International, the corporation at the center of everything, is named after Friedrich Vought, a fictional Nazi scientist who supposedly created the original compound that gives soups their powers during World War II. That backstory gets explored more and more as the seasons progress, and it adds this genuinely unsettling historical weight to what could have just been a fun fictional evil corporation. Instead, it becomes something with actual roots, a lineage of awfulness that stretches back decades. There's real craft in that kind of world building, and it rewards viewers who pay attention. Speaking of world building, the show creates an entire fictional media landscape around Vought. There are fake movie trailers, fake news networks, fake merchandise, fake social media personalities for the superheroes. The level of detail that the production team puts into this parallel world is genuinely remarkable. There are actual functioning websites for Vought International, fake social media accounts for characters like Homelander and Starlight, and promotional materials that get released online to build hype before new seasons. It's one of the most immersive transmedia experiences any streaming show has ever created. And it works because it mirrors our actual world just closely enough to feel a little too real. Let's take a quiet moment and think about Homelander, because he is one of the most carefully constructed villains in recent television history. Anthony Starr, the actor who plays him, is actually from New Zealand. And he has spoken in various interviews about the psychological research he did to prepare for the role. Homelander is not just a powerful bad guy. He's a deeply traumatized individual who was essentially raised in a lab, denied genuine human connection, and turned into both a weapon and a product simultaneously. The team at the show worked to create a character who is terrifying but also, in very specific moments, genuinely pitiable. Not sympathetic in a way that excuses his actions, but pitiable in a way that makes you understand how someone becomes a monster. And here is something that's really interesting to hold on to as you relax. The show consistently explores this idea that fear and power interact in very specific ways. Characters who are visibly afraid of Homelander often end up in worse situations than characters who manage to hold their ground or show him genuine humanity. That's not just a plot mechanic. It's actually rooted in real psychology around dominance and submission dynamics. The writers clearly thought carefully about how power operates, not just in superhero stories, but in corporations, governments, and interpersonal relationships. That's the kind of intellectual depth that makes The Boys worth thinking about even when you're winding down. Now let's float over to talking about the cast, because there are some wonderful little facts here that you might find soothing to drift through. Carl Urban, who plays Billy Butcher, kept his American accent throughout filming for the first several seasons, which is especially impressive given that Urban is a New Zealander. His natural accent is actually quite different from Butcher's specific British working-class voice, which itself required significant dialect work. So Urban was doing a British working-class accent while being a New Zealander working primarily in North America. That's 3 layers of performance just in the voice. Jack Quaid, who plays Huey Campbell, is the son of actors Dennis Quaid and Meg Ryan. He actually modeled some of Huey's nervous energy and emotional accessibility on his own natural personality, describing himself as someone who genuinely feels things deeply and tends to show it. And it shows on screen, because Huey is one of the few characters in the entire show who consistently operates from a place of genuine moral feeling rather than pragmatism or self-interest. He's often wrong about how to act on that moral feeling, but the feeling itself is always real. That's what makes him such an effective anchor for the audience. As you settle deeper into comfort, let's talk about the title cards and episode naming conventions, because there's real thought here too. Episodes of The Boys are often titled after songs, album names, or cultural references that thematically connect to what happens in the story. The show uses these titles as a kind of secondary layer of meaning, a hint at the emotional register of what you're about to watch. For people who catch the references, there's an extra layer of satisfaction. For people who don't, the episodes still work perfectly on their own terms. That's good design. It works on multiple levels without requiring any particular prior knowledge. The production design of The Boys is something that deserves its own appreciation. The Seven's headquarters, the tower, the corporate spaces, all of that was designed to feel like the nightmare version of what you might imagine a superhero-themed corporation actually looking like. Sleek, expensive, deliberately intimidating. The production team drew on references from real corporate architecture, the kind of glass and steel aesthetic that major tech companies and financial firms use to project power and permanence. By putting superheroes in that specific visual context, the show immediately signals that this is not your typical superhero story. This is a story about what happens when power goes entirely unchecked. Let me drift us towards something a little more specific and fun. The Legend of the Legend character, played by Paul Racer, is designed as a nod to real figures from comic book history. In the comics, the character was conceived as a reference to legendary creators who built entire fictional universes and whose legacy became complicated over time. The show uses the character somewhat differently, as a kind of institutional memory for the world of Vought, someone who was there at the beginning and carries all that complicated history. Paul Racer brings a genuine warmth and world weariness to the role that makes the character immediately compelling even without all the context. Something that's easy to miss but worth appreciating as you drift is how the show handles its supporting characters. Even minor characters who only appear in a handful of scenes tend to have coherent internal logic. They have things they want, things they're afraid of, reasons for their behavior that make sense within the world. That kind of consistency is extremely hard to maintain across a large ensemble cast over multiple seasons, and it speaks to a writer's room that takes its work seriously even when the content on screen is absolutely ridiculous. Now let's think about the physical production of the show for a moment, because it was filmed primarily in Toronto, Canada, with occasional location shoots elsewhere. Toronto is one of the great filming cities in the world precisely because it can convincingly double for so many different American environments depending on how you shoot it. The production team was skilled at using the city's varied architecture to create different feels for different parts of the fictional world. The corporate Vought spaces feel different from the street-level neighborhoods where Butcher and his crew operate, and that visual distinction is part of how the show maintains its thematic contrasts. Take a slow breath in and out. Let's talk about the soundtrack choices on the show, because they're frequently surprising and always intentional. The music supervisors have a talent for selecting songs that create ironic contrast with what's happening on screen. Extremely violent or disturbing sequences are sometimes scored with cheerful or nostalgic music, and that juxtaposition does something interesting to your experience as a viewer. It creates a kind of cognitive dissonance that reflects the show's central theme, that the most dangerous things often come packaged in the most appealing containers. Superheroes look like heroes. They're branded, marketed, beloved. And yet, the show's writing team has talked about how they approach each season by first identifying what real-world dynamics they want to explore and then building the story around those dynamics. Rather than starting with plot mechanics and then imposing themes afterward, they start with the question of what they actually want to say. What aspect of power, media, celebrity, corporate behavior, or political manipulation do they want to examine this season? and then they build everything else around that core inquiry. That's a fundamentally different approach from how many television shows are written, and it helps explain why The Boys feels so coherent even when the individual episodes are wildly chaotic. As you sink a little deeper into relaxation, let's appreciate the show's approach to female characters, because it's worth noting. The show has consistently worked to give its female characters agency, complexity, and storylines that aren't just in service of the male characters' arcs. Characters like Starlight, Queen Maeve, Sage, and others are all fully realized people with their own motivations, their own histories, and their own relationships to power. Some of them make choices that are questionable or even terrible. But they're making those choices for their own reasons, not just to serve as props in someone else's story. That's harder to accomplish than it sounds, and the show does it consistently. The relationship between the show and its source material is genuinely interesting from a craft perspective. Kripke and his team knew that a straight adaptation of the comics would not work for mainstream television, both because of content limitations and because the comic-specific satirical targets were rooted in a particular cultural moment that had already passed. So they kept the architecture of the original but renovated everything inside, updating the targets, deepening the character work, and finding new ways to make the core satirical points land for a contemporary audience. It's a masterclass in adaptation as creative interpretation rather than literal translation. Let your shoulders drop a little. Let your jaw unclench. We are going to keep drifting through some of the quieter corners of this fascinating world. The decision to make Homelander an explicit parallel to certain real-world figures was a deliberate choice that the show has leaned into more heavily as the seasons have progressed. The writers have talked about how they're interested in the psychology of charisma, specifically how someone with genuine charisma can use it to get away with increasingly terrible behavior while maintaining a loyal following. Homelander's trajectory across the seasons is essentially a study in how that escalation works. Each season he goes a little further. Each season his followers rationalize a little harder. And the show asks you to sit with the discomfort of recognizing those patterns from the real world. The Compound V mythology in the show is another area where the writers did careful, detailed thinking. The idea that superhero powers come from a pharmaceutical product developed by a corporation means that powers are not inherently heroic. They are manufactured. They are commodified. They are controlled. The corporation decides who gets them, under what conditions, with what restrictions. And that shifts the entire moral landscape of the story in ways that the show keeps exploring from new angles. What does it mean to have power that belongs to someone else? What do you owe them in return? And what happens when you decide you owe them nothing? We are somewhere past the midpoint of our journey now, and you might be feeling that lovely heavy relaxed sensation starting to settle in. Let's keep the thoughts soft and interesting. The character of Mother's Milk, played by Laz Alonso, is one of the show's most thoughtful additions to the story from the original comics. The television version of the character has a much more developed personal life, with family relationships and a specific history with Vought that gives his involvement in the boys' mission a personal dimension beyond just general opposition to corporate superheroism. That kind of specificity is what turns a functional plot character into someone you actually care about. And caring about the characters is what makes the show's darker moments hit as hard as they do. The costume design across the show also reflects the satirical intelligence at work throughout. The Seven's costumes are designed to look like premium branded merchandise, which is exactly what they are in the world of the show. They're commercially designed, focus grouped, optimized for merchandising and media presence. There's nothing organic or personal about them. Contrast that with the more worn, practical aesthetic of Butcher and the Boys, and the visual language immediately tells you something true about where both groups are coming from. One side is performing. The other side, whatever their flaws, is at least being real about what they're doing. Frenchie's character, played by Tomer Capone, has one of the more interesting emotional arcs across the seasons. He carries a significant amount of guilt from his past, guilt that the show slowly unpacks over time, and his relationships with other team members are colored by that guilt in ways that aren't always immediately obvious. Capone has talked about how he approached the character as someone who uses humor and performance as a defense mechanism, keeping people at a specific distance while simultaneously craving genuine connection. That's a very specific and very human psychological profile, and the show gives him enough space to actually explore it. The show's approach to humor is worth appreciating as you let your thoughts drift and slow. The comedy in The Boys is often extremely dark, but it's not mean-spirited in a simple way. The show tends to aim its harshest satirical energy upward, at the powerful and the corrupt and the hypocritical, rather than downward at the vulnerable. The people who get the sharpest treatment are almost always people who deserve it. And within the chaos and darkness, the show also finds moments of genuine warmth and even tenderness between characters who care about each other. Those moments of genuine human connection are what give the darker stuff its weight. Kimiko's character, played by Karen Fukuhara, operates largely without dialogue for significant portions of the earlier seasons, communicating primarily through physicality and expression. Fukuhara has spoken about how she worked with the production team to develop a full internal emotional life for Kimiko even in scenes where she has nothing to say. The result is a character who communicates volumes without words, which is actually a very difficult performance skill. Every fight sequence Kimiko is in is also choreographed to reflect her specific character rather than just generic action choreography. The way she moves tells you who she is. Let the thoughts come slower now. Let them float rather than race. One of the things that makes The Boys genuinely distinctive in the landscape of prestige television is its willingness to be genuinely uncomfortable. Not just edgy or provocative for attention, but actually uncomfortable in ways that make you think about your own relationship with the things being satirized. How much of your media consumption is driven by parasocial attachment to celebrity rather than actual values alignment? How often do you accept the branding of something rather than looking at what's underneath it? The show keeps asking those questions, not by putting them into dialogue but by making you feel the discomfort of the answer. The visual effects work on the show has consistently punched above what you might expect for a television production. The team uses a combination of practical effects, stunt work, and digital effects, and they blend them in ways that keep the action feeling grounded even when the things happening are completely impossible. That groundedness is important because it keeps the characters feeling like people rather than cartoon figures. And when the characters feel like people, the story can actually mean something. Ashley's character arc across the seasons is one of the more quietly interesting threads in the whole show. She starts as a corporate functionary, someone who has genuinely sacrificed her better instincts in service of institutional advancement. And she stays in that compromised position through sheer determined avoidance of anything that might get her noticed or eliminated. There's something both comic and genuinely sad about a character whose primary survival strategy is to become as invisible and inoffensive as possible while surrounded by chaos. And the show is smart enough to acknowledge both dimensions without letting either overwhelm the other. Your breathing is probably slower now. Your body heavier. This is a good place to be. The show's satirical targets have shifted slightly from season to season as the real-world context has evolved. What started primarily as a satire of superhero media and corporate power has expanded to include social media dynamics, political demagoguery, religious institutions, and the psychology of movements built around charismatic but deeply flawed leaders. The writers have proven consistently willing to follow the thematic logic wherever it leads rather than staying in a comfortable lane. That's riskier, and it occasionally means the show overreaches, but it also means it stays genuinely engaged with the world rather than just recycling the same observations. Soulja Boy's character, played by Jensen Ackles, was a significant addition to the later seasons. Ackles, who had worked with Kripke on Supernatural, brought a specific kind of effortless charisma to the role that serves the character perfectly. Soulja Boy is supposed to feel like a certain era's idea of heroism, confident, physical, unreflective, deeply rooted in a set of values that look romantic from a distance and deeply problematic up close. Ackles plays all of that in a performance that's funny and disturbing in roughly equal measure, which is exactly the balance the show was going for. The show's depiction of media dynamics is one of its most consistently sharp satirical elements. Vought functions like a media company as much as anything else, because its superheroes are intellectual properties as much as they are people. They are brands. Their public images are managed with the same ruthless professionalism that any corporation would apply to its most valuable assets. And the show keeps returning to the gap between that carefully managed image and the reality underneath. That gap is where the horror lives. And also, frequently, where the comedy lives. As you settle towards sleep, hold on to this last thought. The Boys is ultimately a show about accountability, specifically what happens when accountability fails, when power goes unchecked, when the systems designed to keep the powerful honest are captured by the powerful themselves. And what it asks is whether ordinary people with ordinary resources and deeply imperfect characters can find ways to hold on to something true in that environment. It doesn't always give optimistic answers, but it takes the question seriously. And that seriousness, underneath all the chaos and the outrageous spectacle, is what makes it matter. Let your thoughts drift now like the quietest possible version of this enormous chaotic world, just the interesting ideas floating by without weight or urgency, the craft that went into building it, the care that went into the characters, the intelligence underneath the madness. Let all of it carry you gently down into a deep and restful sleep. You've earned it. Good night.